Thank you for downloading this episode of ACU Trainees Conversations in Law with me, your host, Hobz. In this episode, I talk to Tara Sherbrooke, the GC at YouGov, about her career path from private practice to in-house. So I suppose if we start with the first question then, you started out with a sort of scientific degree under your belt. Was it always the intention to move into law, or was this something that you stumbled into?
Well, I'm not sure that I stumbled into it, but it certainly wasn't my intention when I was applying for university to become a lawyer. I was very lucky because of the way that I was brought up. Education has always been paramount to my parents, and so I was encouraged to study for the sake of study, for an interest. And I loved science as I was growing up. I'm just really fascinated about how things work. And in pathology, you study the disease by looking at what happens when something goes wrong. You can figure out how to fix it. So that, to me, occurs as a transferable skill. I would argue with anyone, I mean, that's part of one of the reasons perhaps I'm meant to be a lawyer, but I'd argue that law is actually a science and not an art subject. I know it's classified as an art subject at university because it's effectively a framework of rules with a bunch of exceptions. You have a series of hypotheses about, what commercially would be possible if you took different approaches, what regulatory block would be if you take path one, and what commercial, driver would be impacted by path two. You also make hypotheses about the style of negotiation with different clients and different counterparties. How is it going to work and how is it not going to work? And then you test those hypotheses. So I have always stood firmly that law is a science. So I didn't really see it necessarily as a dramatic change. In fact, when I did my conversion and I was applying for training contracts, the firms were delighted. They were all looking for candidates that had something else. So it was quite an advantage at the time. I don't think it's quite so different now. I think people come into law from all sorts of backgrounds. But at the time, it was lauded and praised. So I definitely took advantage of that.
I suppose today with the implementation of the SQE, we're going to see a lot more different backgrounds for future lawyers. So potentially things like sciences and things which traditionally were, avoided by law students. It's going to become more commonplace.
Were they avoided?
I've always believed, from sort of my university days, there was very much a distinction between law students and science students. There wasn't any crossover between the two faculties.
Maybe that's a disadvantage to both.
I agree with you in terms of there are scientific elements to studying law and to practicing law, in terms of how you go about putting things together, solving problems. And I think that teaching them in isolation is problematic. But I don't see how easy it is to change that with, law being as ingrained as it is. It becomes a much harder thing to change.
I don't know, Hobz. I think you're probably right, but I would still challenge you on it. That's part of my nature. I think go to university and learn how to go to school, go to university, learn how to think critically. Go to law school and learn your profession, whether you do a law degree with your 7 core subjects plus jurisprudence and the medieval application of law in modern day something or other, which you're never going to practice, I argue, or I assert now. And then everybody's really on the same path. It just happens that you took a different route to get to that, to that training contract. And there's room for all sorts of different types of lawyers and all sorts of different backgrounds. And I would definitely hire somebody who could explain why they made their choices over somebody who came to me with a CV that was very shiny and, the sort of the well-trodden path, probably, a law degree or a history law degree to a conversion to a, well-known branded firm to a this, that, and the other. I don't necessarily value only that. I'm sure they're an excellent candidate as well, but I don't think one way or the other gives you an advantage or a disadvantage, providing you can give the story as to why you made those choices or why you had to make those choices, because life pushed you in a certain direction, but how you overcame the circumstances and made those choices. That's far more interesting to me. And I think also shows the character of a candidate or the character of a potential hire, because what we do is difficult. And especially at the moment in this strange world we're living in, there are plenty of challenges that we face that are presented to us that we don't have control over or certainty about. And those overarching qualities of resilience, they don't necessarily come from treading the path that you're expected to tread. Perhaps we should arrange a social between the science faculty and the law faculty, or a debate. I don't know, because I think we all get so much value, from diversity, from what we can learn from each other, from being curious. We're going to talk about that later, I know, so I won't rabbit on about it now. But I think there is value in learning from other people and other experiences. What's transferable, what works for them could very well work for us. So I prefer an inclusive approach rather than a faculty versus faculty approach.
You started off there obviously saying what you look for in a candidate is the ability to justify the decisions they've made in terms of their education, their career to date. So if I was to turn that around onto you, then you did have other than your science degree, you did have a fairly traditional route into law. You had a training contract followed by time spent as an associate. What then prompted you to move out of that private practice and try your hand in-house?
I think when I started in private practice, I assumed that I was there for life. I was going to be a partner by the time I was 35, etc., etc., etc. And I was very, very lucky. I trained in an excellent firm with brilliant people, and I had a really positive experience. But what I saw about private practice was I was often called in, or the firm was called in a time of crisis. And what I love about in-house is I'm called in at the beginning of a new product design. So I'm part of the team from day one, and I can see something through from idea to launch, rather than the sort of crisis management, parachute in the very expensive private practice lawyers and try not to talk to them too much because you know that they're charging you by the 6-minute slot. It was a less fulfilling approach to business. I also felt that in private practice, although I got to do a lot of really high profile deals, a lot of really high value deals, I didn't really get to do all the aspects of the deal. So I remember being in private practice just before I moved in-house, and I sent an agreement out to the client for review, and I said, please do complete the schedules of XYZ intellectual property, and let me know if you have any comments or questions, blah, blah, blah. Very nice. That's what we always did in private practice. I turned up on my first day at Element 6, my first in-house move, and they were sort of exasperated. They had 45 hours of review to complete in order to be able to fill out this intellectual property schedule that some other external lawyer had sent them, just like I had done to somebody else. And it's that thing of understanding what you're asking for, why you're asking, what the business processes are to capture and monitor intellectual property. And not every business has that in place to be able to pull a report and just fill out the schedule. It was really eye-opening to how much private practice is sort of a little bit ivory tower. There's an academic excellence, there's the complex, there's the unique. When you're in-house, I've done things from reviewing, NDAs to reviewing, very, very high value transactional documents. I do the whole spectrum, and I have to go away and manage getting the information to complete the IP schedules of what we own and what we don't own and what we're giving warranties, and check, can you give that warranty? Whereas in private practice, there's a lot of sort of give the advice and step away. I prefer rolling my sleeves up and making sure that the results are as we want them to be in their commercial and they drive the business forward.
Do you think that need of yours to be sort of in the mix, to see a project all the way through, an element of that comes from your university degree, in the sense that in science you can't be your hypothesis, you test it, rigorously go over everything and then produce your results, your report at the end. Do you think that's potentially where this comes from?
Maybe that's the case, but I wonder if that's more about me as a person. I mean, before I was a boss and before I was a lawyer, before I was in-house and before I was in private practice, before I went to university and law school, I was Tara. And when I was about 4 years old, I remember being shouted at because I had pulled apart an alarm clock, one of those little battery run alarm clocks, because I just wanted to know how it worked. And I'd left the pieces in a mess on the floor in the living room. And I've always been like that. I've always wanted to understand the why. That really drives me as a human being and as an individual. I guess to put it back on you and your peers, I think my advice would be have a little look at what it is that motivates you. What excites you enough to get you out of bed in the morning, and go for that area of law, go for that sector, because every job's going to have frustrations, whether it's in-house or private practice. You're going to have to do stuff that is less in your sweet spot or more frustrating, or deal with people that you don't want to have to deal with, as well as all of the fantastic individuals that you'll meet. There's always going to be both. So make sure that the higher purpose or the bigger thing, so for me, that's the why, or, seeing something through from start to finish, make sure that your job allows you to do that. And in your training contract, make sure that you get a chance to see different ways of expressing that commitment that you have, that thing that excites you enough to get you out of bed in the morning.
And do you think then that in private practice, it's possible to find, as you put it, the why in a matter? Or do you think that's only findable in-house?
I don't think life is ever quite so one or the other. I think that if you, as a lawyer, if I was a lawyer who was fired up by financial regulation or competition law or something, being in private practice might be exactly where I want to be, because you can, scour over the regulations and lobby governments and do all sorts of things that might really, that is not what fires me up, by the way, Hobz. I hasten to add. But, if I really love competition law, then the place to be for me would be the Competition Markets Authority, no question. Straight in there, asking the questions, making sure that people are doing things fair and in a way consistent with the regulations. I think that would be really interesting. It's not what wakes me up in the morning. It's certainly not what gets me out of bed. What I enjoy is being part of the innovation, capturing the innovation, guiding it and implementing it, so that for me, there's a real thrill of when a product is on a page, to in a prototype, to being tested and then being real, and then you can see the revenue stream coming in, because it's something that the market chooses, something that wasn't there before that was needed, created something from nothing. That for me is what gets me out of bed on these very cold February mornings, the opportunity to be part of that.
So sort of your advice would be then that when you're looking at your legal career, not necessarily just to go for what everybody else is going for, the traditional law degree, LPC, training contracts, associate partnership, but actually look at what you want, what you're interested in, and finding a career that suits that.
I think that's a really lovely summary of it. And, I remember applying for training contracts, newly qualified jobs, even though I was kept on at Norton Rose. It's a very stressful time because there is such uncertainty, and the candidates are fantastic. Probably half the people you were at law school or did your PGDL with, or whatever route you took in, and you will have met a lot of really interesting, bright, brilliant people. Everyone's looking for the same thing, that job that's going to be fulfilling and interesting and help them with their personal and professional development into training and becoming a lawyer. I think knowing yourself is critical at any stage of your career and application for jobs, because there's a lot of pressure that comes, particularly at the trainee sort of stage. I think maybe it's because you're younger and less experienced perhaps in the world of work, if it's your first career, perhaps not if you're coming to it as a second career, but there is this sort of this pressure, this need to do well, a feeling that it's a very competitive environment, and perhaps that prevents people from remembering that it is actually a choice. You are the commander of your ship, you are driving your career, you are driving your journey. So knowing the direction you'd like to go in and trying for that, even if maybe you have to take a step sideways to get there, maybe it won't all be smooth sailing for everybody all the time, but knowing what you want, I think, is 50% of the problem solved, because you can always see, well, maybe this seat isn't my first choice, but I'm going to go into it for 6 months and learn everything I can possibly learn and get as much practice of hands-on drafting as possible, because I know that it will be transferable when I get to do a seat in the thing that excites me or the thing that I think I really want to qualify into. Does that resonate?
Yes, I think it does. There is an element that when you are starting out in a legal career looking for legal work, you do sometimes have to take things which don't necessarily interest you, but it's seeing in that work that there are useful skills, there are useful learning points that will help you get to where you want to be in the end.
And it's important to remember that when you're working in a team, and particularly, my in-house team, we are lean, small but perfectly formed, but we're busy. I know that people don't always want to do everything that comes across their desk, and there'll be contracts or clients that they prefer to work with over others, and it's about being a little bit honest about that. We have certain questions that come from certain jurisdictions that are always difficult, and we have a little joke in the team like, oh God, here we go, who's going to take this one, because it's always complicated. And being open and honest about it as a team is another thing. Being open and honest with yourself, or finding some friends or family or a mentor who knows you, having the conversation, like, what would suit me? Am I going for this big name private practice firm because I feel I should? Or is it really something that's going to match my strengths and bring out my best bits? And is it going to train through the things that I need training on and develop my weaknesses? Be really honest with yourself. And it's not always necessarily pretty. I have to talk to myself about some of the perfectly human reactions that I have to having to get some work done in unreasonable timeframes. And, really all I want to do is go and spend the evening watching Netflix like my children are doing. But I can't always do that because I have to be grown up. And, I'm allowed to say that because it's honest. I'd love to be watching Netflix, but I'm going to do my work because that's my accountability and I'm responsible. It's very human.
So you mentioned then there was an element in sort of introspective reflection in choosing the path you choose, whether or not you go for one of the top law firms or you look more in-house. Having had that experience of both choosing a law firm for a training contract and choosing a in-house team to further your legal career, did you find that process similar in terms of selecting the company you want to work for?
So do you mean when I appoint external advisors?
No, so when you set out to move in-house, how did you select Element 6? There were many different companies that do that sort of work. How did you know that was the one to go for?
As you become more senior, I was by this point specialised. I think it was about 8 years, maybe more. I had been working as a commercial intellectual property lawyer. There is an element of opportunity because jobs become available or they don't. And I think as you become more senior in your career, I certainly found that, I think when I moved to YouGov from ICE, one of the benchmarking reports about possible general counsel roles is that there's about 50 of those in the UK that become available a year. It's not common. So there's an element of luck, there's an element of opportunity, timing, circumstance. For me, I was at Osborne Clarke. I had 2 quite young children. I think at the time I was working 4 days rather than 5 because they were tiny, tiny. And I got a call from a headhunter. And I think I probably was questioning where my career would go at Osborne Clarke. I had been included in this development program that they put senior associates on who they thought would be suitable for partnership track. But making partner has changed over my career. I don't know what it takes now because I've been out of private practice for a while. But when I started my training contract, partnership was this amazing thing that everybody wanted, and it entailed, there was equity on the table, and it happened, in your mid to late 30s. And then as I did my training contract and I completed that, and as I then practiced as a lawyer in a private practice firm, I watched the partnership appointments becoming older and older and older and later and later and later. And I suddenly sort of thought, when is this going to happen for me? And is this really what I want? And I did that thing that I've just recommended to you and your peers or whoever's listening to this podcast, which is, reassess, have a look. What is it that I really wanted? And I got a call from a headhunter, which offered me this role at Element 6. It was sole IP counsel, so there was a lot of autonomy. It was located a 15-minute cycle ride from my house, and I'm not ashamed to admit that did factor in, because it meant that I could be home to see my children who were very young before they went to sleep. And in private practice, very often I didn't get home until after they were already in bed. Those sort of factors. So it fit and gave me balance in my life at the right sort of time.
Is there anything then that you miss or that you regret having now moved in-house and made your career there?
Not at all. One of the questions you asked is, would you move back into private practice? And I mean, never say never. I won't ever kind of commit my future, but I am delighted. I love my job. I'm very privileged that as a general counsel, I'm senior within the business. I get included in the conversations that interest me at the level that interests me. In private practice, who knows whether I would have been partner or in a management committee or, doing that sort of stuff. But I certainly don't have any regrets. I miss very much my PA. When I was at Morrison Forster, I had the best PA ever. Her name was Joanne. And I would really love to have somebody to help me with all of the admin and management and allow me to concentrate on the other side of things that I love, the strategy, the drafting, the negotiation, all of those sort of things. But otherwise, I can't think of anything that I miss in private practice. And I guess that sort of elephant in the room question, which is the salary point. I moved in-house and I ended up earning, because companies often have an attainable bonus structure, I ended up earning as much money as I would have earned in that first year as a salaried partner without having any of the business development obligations, because, of course, my clients all came to me. There was nowhere else for them to go. So they were a slightly captive market. At a time in my life when I needed to be at home because I had family commitments, I got to do both. I got to do really interesting work without those business development pressures. And I didn't sacrifice at the time the salary. Obviously, if you make partner in one of the big firms, or maybe not even in one of the big firms, you're making partner, you probably overtake the in-house salaries quite swiftly. But I didn't go into law to make money. I don't know about anyone else. I chose law because as a scientist, I like understanding how things work. I like the cerebral aspect, the cerebral part of the profession. And I make a good living, and I don't need to make a lot of money. I think if I'd wanted to make a lot of money, if money was my motivator for working, I probably would have become a banker or a hedge fund manager or something else. So for me, it's not a regret, no.
And do you think then, sort of hypothetically, if that headhunter didn't give you a call, would you have moved out, or do you think you'd still be at Morrison Forster or another private practice firm?
Gosh, good question. I expect that I would have started looking at some point. I think one of the things that I know that you want to touch on is diversity, equality, and inclusion in the legal profession, something that is very important to me. as a working mum who was always raised being told that I could do anything and have everything and anything was available to me, doesn't matter what your gender is, I didn't find that to be the truth, or no one's to blame, just the practicalities of having a lot of responsibilities at home as well as at work. I didn't find that easy. And I think probably in-house offers balance a little bit more. And I went on this training course when I was on the partnership track, which said, why is it that lawyers are always seeking to perfect, whereas in industry, everybody's just delighted with it extraordinary, and actually most of the time they settle for good enough? And it was a really interesting kind of moment for me, like a light bulb moment, because all of my friends who are lawyers, we're all quite A-type. And if I got 98% in a test at school, I would say, well, what was the 2% that I missed, rather than celebrating the 98%. It's not normal. When you get out of law firms and you get out of, you don't hang out with lawyers all the time, you find that most people, if they got 98% in a test, they would be, throwing a party and celebrating. But I think I probably would have gone and moved because it suits my personality better.
But maybe not as immediately, and it would have been a longer private practice career for you.
Well, I was at the sweet spot in I was really useful. I look at candidates now and I think, God, I'd just kill for, 6 years, 8 years qualified, because they are absolutely able to run with most things and know exactly what to escalate and when. Probably confident enough to make a few calls on their own, and still junior enough to communicate those transparently to their boss, so I know what's going on. And that for me is the perfect team member. But so I was in that sweet spot. If you ever look at in-house adverts for roles, they are always asking for that sort of level, but they often want in-house experience. So I was very lucky to have done a secondment in-house when I was doing my training contract. That really shone through on my CV, because I didn't have, with my first move from private practice to in-house, I didn't really have much to substantiate applicable transferable experience to an in-house role. And they were willing to take a bit of a punt on me and a bit of a risk, because the interviews showed that I could work with my then boss and we got along well, etc. But yeah, definitely I can't tell you whether or not I would have been more proactive. I think I had quite a lot going on in my life with, pureeing butternut squash and trying to, negotiate massive European grants for partnership research with universities and all at the same time. So I probably wouldn't have been the sort of person to move jobs proactively at that precise moment. But all it takes, I believe, Hobz, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're sort of in a bit of a day sleepwalking through all of your commitments, it's very overwhelming with young kids, trying to manage everything. It's not until something sort of wakes you up. There's always an event that interrupts your thought processes. And for me, it might have been that the headhunter called me and that sort of made me think, well, actually, what do I want? But it'll be something different for other people. You look at the career development within your team for other people and you think, hang on a minute, have they promoted people like me, or are there people like me in the leadership team of this particular company? Is it the right place for me? It's a constant assessment. I mean, I feel like I've talked a lot about the time of my career where I moved in-house, about the impact of having family responsibilities as well as a drive for a fulfilling and, interesting career at a high level, that there's a natural tension for a few years of your life. And so what you want may change. So it's very important to keep assessing yourself, check back in. Are you happy? Are you fulfilled? Are you contributing in as much as you possibly can? I don't know about you, Hobz, but I believe that human beings are to a degree driven by a need to contribute, by a need to be part of something bigger than themselves. And so if I'm at a firm cruising along with doing something that's very, very easy, that's not going to hold my attention for very long. So I don't know. I think probably to sum it up, I needed to be interrupted because of where I was in my life, and the call from the headhunter was that interruption. But at this stage in my life, a call from a headhunter wouldn't encourage me to move, because at the moment, the job that I'm doing is absolutely brilliant, fascinating and engaging, and I'm loving it.
Now, we've sort of alluded to a couple of times in this episode to diversity and inclusion. And now that you are a GC, you have the decision-making power, as it were, to choose which law firms you work with. Do non-legal factors such as diversity and inclusion play a significant part in the decision to contract out to a firm?
So I've just established the first panel of external legal advisors at YouGov. And the reason for a panel is because we want to form partnerships with our external advisors. I want to know that when I pick up the phone, I don't have to give them the background every time. We're developing a relationship, and we understand each other. They know what I think and how I work and the sort of scope of review, the type of review that I'm looking for. So this is the first external advisory panel that YouGov has had. I'm the first GC, so that won't surprise you. And I did it in a very structured way. We had a formal RFP. The kind of firms that we accepted responses from were all excellent. They're all names that you recognize. They all have excellent reputation. They're all doing good work, no question. And so one of the things that they all sort of replied to us with surprise about was how structured my requests were around diversity and inclusion. I work at a data company. Let's put this in perspective. I want to know the data around what you're doing. I'm not massively interested in how many network you're a member of as a firm. I want to know who's reporting what. Now, I appreciate there's all sorts of data protection issues around reporting a lot of this diversity data, but I want to employ a law firm that can figure out a way of getting around that, not just from a legal perspective and a technical perspective, but also from a leadership perspective. So this is a firm that culturally needs to value diversity and inclusion to the extent that the partners are talking about whether their parents went to university or not. Are they first generation, second generation? Why is it that you're reporting that you don't have a gender pay gap, but when we look at the bonus data, female employees across the board are receiving a significant percentage lower bonus? Is that something to do with your workflow? Is it transparent? Is it fair? Is one person in the team, possibly a guy, possibly not, getting all the really good deals? The data allows us to ask the questions and perhaps have some of the conversations that as a profession we haven't been having. So the RFP that I put together really drilled down into what are you asking your company to report to you and what are you doing with that information? It's interesting that a lot of firms refuse to have targets. They don't want to be held to a target. And they have lots and lots of lawyerly arguments about why targets are perhaps, disadvantageous and they can drive bad behavior because people are aiming for the target rather than the cultural change, and all of these wonderful, brilliant lawyers giving me brilliant arguments. And, my answer is just to the firms, like, what's your commitment? What's your aspiration? It doesn't need to be a target to bang yourself over the head with, but let's acknowledge as an industry that we are not massively diverse, we are not very inclusive, and we potentially are not as equal as we could be. And let's not focus on blaming or looking at targets to bang ourselves over the head with. Let's look at actions that are going to make a difference to everybody, to all the people who want to join the legal profession, regardless of where they went to school or didn't go to school, regardless of their route in, whether they did a science degree, Hobz, or whether they did a more classical expected entry via history or law. It is really important to me. And so we made the firms substantiate what they're doing with data And some firms pulled out of the process when they saw what they were going to be required to provide to us by way of data. And I'm delighted about that as well, because I know that there are 4 or 5 firms out there in the market who had to have a conversation internally about why they weren't going to go for the RFP with YouGov, because there'll be a woman in the room, or there'll be a trainee in the room, or there'll be somebody from a visible characteristic or not a visible characteristic of diverse nature in the room when they were preparing or not preparing or deciding to do this pitch for the panel at YouGov. And they had to have a conversation about why they're not going for it. And I think that's just as valuable. If everybody, can you imagine if everybody across the industry was having the conversation about their statistics, their data, their diversity, the cultural change would follow, because the conversation is what's important. No blame. I have nothing but respect for the firms that are actively engaged in membership networks and genuinely believe that everybody I spoke to is committed to diversity and inclusion in some way, whether it's because it's something that socially interests them or whether it's because it's something that they can see a business value in, which the statistics, by the way, substantiate. I don't have a problem with why people want to do it. I just want to get more people engaged. I think that's how we will impact change and affect improvement in this area in the legal industry.
Do you think then that more clients need to sort of include diversity and inclusion as a factor when choosing work?
Absolutely. I would encourage anybody who has any control over any budget, whether it's a legal budget or whether it is your own personal choice on what brand of washing powder you buy, to have a look at accountability in a supply chain. We are not alone. If I insist that law firms behave in a way that is consistent with what I believe is the current social move for diversity and inclusion, then that accountability moves through the firm. People are allowed to be different. People don't have to be nervous about having conversations that maybe they were nervous about having before, because they know that the clients have that expectation that there will be a diverse team, that there will be recruitment from more universities than just Oxbridge.
And do you think that the legal industry, it is getting better?
Well, when are you comparing it to? What's your benchmark? Because yes, I like to think that it is getting better. I'm a glass half full kind of person most of the time. Pandemic aside, I do think it's getting better. I think there is only one direction it can move in, because I think socially the tides have changed in such a way that it's bigger than just the legal profession. The conversation that we're having at the moment is a global conversation. However, my question, I guess, back to you is, are we doing enough? Are we making sure that it's not sort of just lip service to the fashion? Are we making sure that this is not a fad, that this is actually something we're weaving into the fibre of the profession? And that's why it's not an accident that I ended up in a data company, but that's why the data is so important, because it's back to that clock I took apart, isn't it, when I was 4 years old? It gives you the why. It shows you how to make an hypothesis. If we recruit actively from universities other than the ones that usually have a good law recommendation, law degree, stats, I don't know what you call them, league tables, that's the word. If we actively go to career fairs in other places, will we get a more diverse group of candidates? And will those diverse candidates bring something to the table that we haven't had before? And does that enrich our table? I think it does.
I suppose then that really this is a sort of a time will tell matter. We have to see whether or not the improvements in diversity and inclusion, whether or not they keep going, whether or not the data, as you say, keeps showing that law firms and every other industry are continuing to make steps to make things more inclusive. And it is a matter of watching this space and making sure in the meantime that we as individuals are doing as much as possible to support that, both in our professional careers and our personal lives.
Absolutely. And again, don't fall for the target approach only. Like when I say I love the data. I love understanding the why. But the qualitative story is as important. Being able to marry that quantitative assessment with the qualitative, how does it feel to work in a private practice law firm now compared to when I was a trainee? I don't know. I'm not there. But I know that I can make sure that my team have a certain experience of the workplace. As a manager, as a boss, as a leader in the profession, that's the other thing that I can do. Make sure that the people who I impact and train have a safe space to be able to say this works or this doesn't work. When they, either they'll take my job when I retire, or they'll move into fantastic other opportunities in the profession. We're all in this together, and they will take with them that sense of fairness and diversity and inclusion that we have, that they expect from our team. So it becomes the normal rather than it being something that we need to change. So I think your original point was, only time will tell. What I put back to you is, you're absolutely right. We'll only know if we've met our targets and, won the war. But every single day is part of the journey, and the journey matters. So it's those microaggressions that maintain a horrible workplace. Have you heard, I don't know if you've done some unconscious bias training or some diversity training, but they talk about these microaggressions. It's not really an intention, but it's a little thing that somebody says that causes a small upset, but it's ignored because it's only little. If we can develop team environments where those things are picked up and they're called on and people communicate their experiences freely, then that becomes the norm. And those microaggressions are just evolved out. I think that there are big wins and small wins. I don't think you can look at it as just achieving those ultimate aims where the data shows that the legal profession is diverse and inclusive. I think it's also about yours and my team and your peers' everyday experience of getting up every morning and wanting to get out of bed, not just because we're excited about what we do, but we're also excited and happy and fulfilled by the people who we share that experience with.
I think that's a really good note to end today's episode on. Before we go, there is a question I'd like to ask all of my guests then. If you were starting out your legal career today, what would you be looking for in a law firm or in-house?
It's a fantastic question, because I'm coming to it with years and years of confidence that I've built over time, which I certainly didn't have when I was applying for my training contract. I was absolutely convinced that all of the other candidates would have so many more qualifications than I did. I mean, they hadn't done a strange science degree, so I was convinced that I would be, seen as this odd wild card applicant. So it was very difficult to think about, to put myself back in those shoes. I think, taking aside my changed sort of confidence and the fact that I've grown up a little bit, I hope, since then, I think what's really, really important is looking for people you can learn from. Everybody has a different management style. Teams have a different approach. Where will you fit? Where will the chemistry work for you, so that on those days when you're doing something that isn't very interesting, or on those days when there's a challenge or a crisis, you can still learn and develop through that, because you know that the people who are, giving you that training, giving you that experience, giving you that feedback are people that you can listen to. And I think, remember, you spend, especially as trainees and juniors, you spend a lot of time working. I mean, I know we're not all in the office at the moment, but the office environment isn't just a professional environment. It's somewhere where I certainly developed personally as well. And working with people I respect, that I have common values, common goals, common approach to my professional career, etc., that's really important. I guess it comes back to what we talked about earlier. Take a good look and get to know yourself, And that will make all of these questions much, much easier to answer. I don't think it's particularly good advice because, of course, getting to know yourself takes time, and the data will only tell us if we've made it a little bit later in the journey, right, Hobz?
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Tara. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
It's been lovely to speak to you too. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks so much for listening to this edition of Conversation in Law. If you'd like to support me and the show, please rate it 5 stars on the iTunes Store and follow the show on your podcast app. If you'd like more information about this episode and any other episodes, then take a look at the trainee blog on the AccuTrainee website. That's www.accutrainee.com. Thank you for listening.